Hey folks, now that Icecrown Citadel is finally being released in Wrath Classic, you're also able to attempt its associated dungeons, which must be completed in a specific order. Forge of Souls is the first dungeon in the trio, and in this video I'll teach you everything that you need to know in order to easily clear it on both normal and heroic difficulty. It's worth noting though that this dungeon is only available to level 80 characters, and both difficulties are completely identical in terms of mechanics. The heroic version obviously has mobs with slightly more health and damage, and it does drop better loot, but all of the abilities are exactly the same on both difficulties. With all of that being said, let's discuss Forge of Souls. Upon entering this dungeon for the first time, you'll need to pick up the quest Echoes of Tortured Souls from the nearby quest giver. For Horde players, this NPC will be Sylvanas, but Alliance players will instead see Jaina. It's very important that you don't forget to pick up this quest, as completing it is the only way to unlock access to the next dungeon, Pit of Sauron. Once you've picked up the quest, you can proceed down the hallway and fight the first trash mobs, a pair of Soulguard Watchmen. These skeletons appear frequently throughout the instance, and they'll always come in groups of 2. Despite their appearance, they're honestly pretty weak, and their only notable ability is an 8-second buff which reflects the next 2 incoming spells. If you're a caster, you can either downrank to safely clear off the stacks, or just wait for melee to finish off the mobs. After killing these first 2 skeletons, you'll take a right and continue forward until you reach a 4-mob trash pack consisting of a Soulguard Bonecaster, Adept, and 2 Reapers. While none of these mobs are particularly scary, I'd recommend focusing the Bonecaster down first, as it has 2 abilities which deal a moderate amount of group-wide damage. Bone Volley is a cast that you should interrupt whenever possible, and he will also gain an Absorb Shield which explodes and hits the group after it breaks. The Adept is next on your kill priority, as it'll cast Drain Life on random players and attempt to heal other mobs with Shadow Mend. Make sure you keep an eye on this mob while killing the Bonecaster, as it's important to interrupt any Shadow Mend casts immediately. The Adepts will also cast Shadow Bolt at random targets, but you should let these go through, as it doesn't hit very hard and it means they'll cast their other 2 abilities less often. Finally, the Soulguard Reapers will spam Shadowlance, instantly dealing a moderate amount of damage to a random player. This may put a bit of strain on your healer, but there's no real way to stop the casts other than killing off the mobs. The Reapers will also periodically cast Frost Nova, dealing moderate AoE damage and rooting nearby players. As long as your ranged DPS and healers don't stand in melee range, this ability should not be an issue. A bit further ahead, you'll encounter another group of trash wherein 4 caster mobs can be found channeling into a Soul Horror. This new mob will be your top kill priority whenever it's present in a pack, as it frequently drops all threat and begins attacking a random DPS or healer. As for the other 4 mobs, you'll find another Adept and Bonecaster, and you should still prioritize killing these 2 enemies after you finish off the Soul Horror. The other 2 casters are a new mob type, Soulguard Animator, but they aren't too difficult to manage. They'll sometimes begin casting Soul Sickness on a random player, and this can either be interrupted while it's being cast, or dispelled after the debuff is applied. If the debuff doesn't get dispelled after 8 seconds, the affected player is stunned for 5 seconds. These mobs will also frequently cast Soul Siphon on a random player, and I'd actually recommend letting them fully channel this ability. The damage it deals is extremely low relative to Soul Sickness or their spammable Shadow Bolt, and the only other downside is a debuff, which makes the targeted player deal 10% less damage for a few seconds. Once you've reached the section of the dungeon with the big metal bridges suspended in midair, you'll fight a few more packs of trash that are identical to the ones we've already discussed. As a quick summary, always interrupt Shadow Mend from the Adepts, Bone Volley from the Bonecasters, and Soul Sickness from the Animators. Your kill priority is Soul Horrors first, then Bonecasters, then Adepts, and then whatever is left over. In addition to all of this trash, you'll sometimes encounter Spiteful Apparitions, which are ghostly skulls that will suddenly appear next to your group. Shortly after these mobs become visible, they'll begin casting Spite, which is a self-destruct spell that causes them to deal a large amount of damage to all nearby players. If they appear while you're in combat with other mobs, I would recommend swapping to them ASAP and finishing them off before the cast finishes. However, if one pops up while you're out of combat, you can probably just run away from it and let the mob explode away from the group. Lastly, once you begin approaching the second building suspended in midair, you'll encounter another patrol of 2 Soulguard Watchmen. If you really want to, it is technically possible to skip past these mobs when they reach the end of their patrol, but usually I find it's faster and easier to just kill them off. From here, you can head up the nearby ramp and ignore the pack up ahead, which contains a Soul Horror and 2 Animators. Within this next room, you'll encounter Bronjam, the first boss of the dungeon. During Bronjam's initial phase, he'll cast 2 different abilities. Magic's Bane is a whirlwind attack that Bronjam uses frequently, and it deals heavy damage to the entire group. The scariest part about this ability is that it actually deals additional damage equal to half of the caster's mana pool, up to a total of 10,000 damage. As you might imagine, this means that casters and healers will get absolutely demolished by this boss. There really isn't anything you can do to avoid this. Your healer will just need to do their best to keep everyone alive. That being said, I'd recommend you don't run this dungeon with a full group of caster DPS if possible, as this mechanic will put an absurd amount of strain on your healer. Bronjam's other Phase 1 mechanic is Corrupt Soul, a spell that he'll channel into a randomly selected DPS or healer. If you get targeted by this ability, you should run away from the boss towards the sides of the room. After 4 seconds, an attackable soul will appear at the affected player's location, and it'll begin moving towards the boss. All DPS should hard swap to the soul and kill it as quickly as possible, because if it manages to reach the boss without dying, he'll be healed for roughly 30% of his HP. Normally, you should be able to easily kill these souls before they reach him, but if you're in a group with low DPS, there are a few tricks you can use. For starters, the tank can kite the boss away from the souls, as this gives the DPS a bit more time to finish them off. Alternatively, if the person targeted by Corrupt Soul has an immunity such as Ice Block, Divine Shield, or Cloak of Shadows, you can use that to negate the spell entirely and avoid summoning an ad. A few other abilities, such as a Hunter's Feigned Death, can also be used to stop Bronjam from casting. Once the boss reaches 35% health, he'll teleport to the center of the room and transition into his second phase. During this phase, Bronjam will be rooted in place and cannot be moved by the tanks, so make sure to only push him to 35% once all active souls have been killed. Shortly after teleporting, the boss will cast Soulstorm, which creates a large AoE zone around the edges of the room. Everyone in your party will therefore need to run into melee range in order to avoid taking heavy damage. For the rest of the encounter, Bronjam will spam cast Shadow Bolts on random players, and he'll periodically cast Fear, causing the targeted player to run into the Soulstorm. While feared, the affected player will be taking heavy ticking damage from the storm, so healers will need to watch out for this. After Bronjam has been taken down, you can head out the back door of his room and take a right to begin moving towards the final boss. Before you get there, you'll need to deal with one more pair of Soulguard Watchmen, followed by a series of Spectral Warden patrols. These Wardens are really nasty, and I would highly recommend sneaking past the first one into the nearby hallway. You'll quickly run into another Spectral Warden, which your tank should drag a bit further down the hall while the rest of the group follows behind. Make sure nobody in your party is standing in the entry of this hallway, as pulling an extra Spectral Warden could lead to a wipe. The Wardens cast 2 abilities, the first of which is Veil of Shadow, a 75% healing reduction on the entire party. This is especially spooky when combined with the other ability it spam casts, Wail of Souls, as this deals heavy damage to the entire group. While you can technically decurse the healing reduction, it'll be quickly reapplied by the Spectral Warden, so realistically this mob is just a damage and healing check. Once you've defeated the 2 Wardens in this hallway, you can engage the final boss, Devourer of Souls. Unlike Bronjam, which can be pretty easily zerked down, this boss will prove a bit tricky if you don't handle the mechanics properly. For starters, the boss will constantly cast Phantom Blast on the tank, which does a pretty hefty amount of damage. Thankfully, this cast can be interrupted, so DPS should try to help the tank out as much as possible. Additionally, if you're playing a Prot Warrior, you can Spell Reflect the Phantom Blast to deal a lot of damage back to the boss. The boss will also periodically cast Mirrored Soul on a random DPS or healer, and this is the most important mechanic of the fight by far. When this debuff is active on a player in your group, any damage dealt to the Devourer of Souls will also be dealt to the affected party member. If you are a DPS player, you must stop doing damage when this cast goes out, or you will kill one of your friends. Every single time I've run this dungeon, the player with Mirrored Soul gets completely nuked because none of the DPS hold back at all. While the boss is still technically killable even if you're down 1 player, it's a bit of a dick move to blindly tunnel and kill someone off. In addition to these 2 aforementioned mechanics, the boss will sometimes leap towards a random ranged player and create a puddle at their feet called Well of Souls. This doesn't do anything special aside from creating a damage zone on the ground, so just move out of it if you get targeted. Finally, the boss has 2 stronger abilities that he'll alternate between as the fight goes on. The first of these abilities will always be Unleashed Souls. This causes a swarm of untargetable ghosts to appear throughout the room and fixate on random players. If they get close to you, they'll start whacking you with some light auto attacks. While you could kite away from the ghosts to avoid taking damage, in practice they don't actually hit very hard, so your group should probably just continue DPSing and heal through the incoming damage. The final ability of the fight will only be cast if the encounter goes on for over a minute. In all of the testing runs I've done, the boss will die well before this, but if your group has low damage, you should be prepared to handle Wailing Souls, as it's a pretty nasty ability. Upon casting this, the boss will fire a laser beam in the direction of a random player, so the group should spread out ahead of time to avoid having multiple players get hit. After the laser beam starts, the boss will rotate around the room and deal massive damage to anyone hit. As I said before though, provided your DPS is good and you don't kill off people with Mirrored Soul, the boss should be dead before this mechanic can even be cast. Once the fight is over, you can turn in your quest to Sylvanas or Jaina, which unlocks Pit of Sauron and allows you to pick up the next quest in the chain. And with that, we've covered everything you need to know in order to clear normal or heroic Forge of Souls in Wrath of the Lich King Classic. If you want to learn more about the other dungeons present in Wrath Classic, I'd recommend checking out my Dungeon Guide playlist, which you can find linked in the description below. Additionally, if you're interested in trying the new hard mode difficulties that Blizzard has added to Wrath Classic, I have a separate guide for all dungeons which can be found in the description. If you found this video helpful, I'd highly encourage you to toss it a like, as that'll help other people find it as well.